The letter came wrapped in a bank draft, which was Edmund's idea of wit. Cassandra Hale found both on the breakfast table at Fenwick Hall, propped against the milk jug where she couldn't miss them, and she understood, before she'd broken the seal, that her cousin had chosen the placement himself. Edmund did nothing carelessly. He had learned that from his father, who had learned it from the elder Mr. Hale, and Cassandra sometimes thought the whole family's talent for cruelty had been handed down like silver, polished a little more with each generation until it shone. The draft was for £400. The letter was from the bank. She read the second one twice, because the first time the words hadn't arranged themselves into sense. In light of the estate's continued shortfall against the mortgage terms, and absent clear evidence of productive management, the bank regrets it will be unable to renew the facility past Lady Day. 6 weeks. She set it down beside her plate with the particular care of a woman who did not trust her own hands. "Bad news?" Edmund asked, though his voice held no question in it at all. He was buttering toast with the unhurried attention of a man who already knew the answer and simply wanted to watch her arrive at it. "The bank wants proof the land pays its way. And does it? It will." Edmund smiled, the toast forgotten. "You've 6 weeks and 1 bad harvest behind you, Cass. I've offered you a fair price twice now. A third time would be charity, and I'm not a charitable man." He said it lightly, the way he said everything designed to wound, as if cruelty delivered with a smile were somehow not cruelty at all. "There's a hunt breakfast at Thornecliff on Saturday. The Duke's steeplechase, his own course, across his own land, open to any rider bold enough to enter. I've put your name down." "You've done what?" "Put your name down. It seemed only right. If you mean to convince a bank you're fit to run 400 acres, you might start by convincing the county you're fit to sit a horse in company." He rose, dabbing his mouth with a napkin that had been her mother's. "Everyone will be there. Lord and Lady Ferris, the Ashworth sisters. His Grace himself, I'm told, rides the course every year and has never once been beaten on it." He paused at the door, and here the smile thinned into something closer to the truth of him. "You'll ride Samson, I suppose. It should be memorable." He left her with the letter, the draft, and the particular silence of a room built to hold more people than it currently did. Cassandra did not cry. She had discovered, in the 8 months since her father's death, that tears cost more than they were worth. They left her with a headache, and Edmund with satisfaction, and she preferred to spend her feeling on something that returned interest. She looked instead at her hands, chapped from the cold press of ledger pages turned too many nights running, one knuckle scarred where a hay hook had caught her 3 winters back, helping Tom Bell bring in the last cut before a storm. They were not a lady's hands. She had stopped pretending to regret it. Samson was in the home paddock, head over the rail, ears swiveling toward the house the way they always did when trouble was afoot, as if he could smell it on the wind the same as rain. He was a Suffolk punch, chestnut going gold where the winter sun caught his coat, built along the lines of the plough he'd been bred to pull, deep through the chest, calm through the eye, entirely unsuited to jumping a 5-bar gate at speed in pursuit of anything at all. He had been her father's last horse, bought cheap at a dispersal sale because nobody else had wanted an animal too big for the carriage and too slow for the hunt, and her father had loved him for exactly the reasons everyone else had passed him by. "They mean to make a fool of me," she told him, and he leaned his considerable weight into her palm, unbothered, the way he was unbothered by most things. "On your back, as it happens." She thought of refusing, She turned the thought over for the length of one full circuit of the paddock rail, testing its weight, and set it down again. Edmund wanted her humiliated, because a humiliated woman sold cheap and asked no questions. If she stayed home, he would tell the county she hadn't dared come, and that story would travel faster and do more damage than any fall she might take at Thornecliff. There was no version of the next 6 weeks in which she was not, in some fashion, on display. She might as well choose the stage. "Saturday, then," she said, and Samson blew warm breath against her wrist, as though he understood the bargain and found the terms acceptable, which was more than she could say for herself. Thornecliff, on the morning of the steeplechase, looked like a plate from a magazine she couldn't have afforded even before her father's debts. Horses stood along the drive in blankets the color of their owners' crests, groomed to a shine that made the frost look deliberate, a decoration rather than a nuisance. Riders clustered in knots of bright wool and good humor, their breath fogging the cold air, their laughter carrying with the particular ease of people who had never once wondered whether a bank would still be speaking to them by Lady Day. Cassandra rode in on Samson at a walk, because he did not know how to arrive any other way, and felt the drive go quiet around her the way a room goes quiet when someone says a word that oughtn't be said at breakfast. She kept her chin where she'd decided to keep it before she left the house, level, forward, unbothered, and did not look at Edmund, who she could hear laughing somewhere to her left, with 2 women in blue riding habits, nor at the groom, who had stopped mid-stride to stare, nor at the boy holding a gray mare, who whispered something to his neighbor that made them both duck their heads to hide their grins. She had almost reached the mounting block when the Duke of Thornecliff rode out from behind the stable block on a black stallion that moved like something poured rather than ridden, and the drive went quieter still. Gabriel Ashworth was not a handsome man in any way that magazines would have troubled to illustrate. He was simply, undeniably present, the kind of man a room arranged itself around without being asked to. He rode past the assembled field with the brief, sweeping attention of someone counting his guests, and his gaze caught on Cassandra the way a boot catches on a root, without malice, purely by accident of the ground. He looked at Samson. He looked at her mended habit, gray wool gone silver at the seams where she'd let it out twice since her mother wore it. He looked, she thought, rather longer than politeness required, at the calluses she hadn't thought to hide, because she'd forgotten, for one unguarded moment, that anyone here would think to look. And then he laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, not exactly. Shorter than Edmund's, more startled than unkind, gone almost as soon as it arrived. But it landed harder than anything her cousin had said all week, because Edmund's cruelty she had priced in long ago, and this was new, and new things always cost more than you expected. The Duke turned to the man beside him and murmured something she didn't catch, and the man laughed too, and then the horn sounded, and the moment was simply over, folded into the larger noise of the morning, as though it had never happened at all. Cassandra sat very still on Samson's broad back and reminded herself, with the flat, practiced patience of someone who had done this before, that shame was only useful to the people who wanted to see it. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing it now. The horn sounded a second time, and the field went forward like water finding a slope, and there was no more room in her chest for anything except the ground in front of her. The course ran east across Thorncliff's home fields before dropping into the wooded combe that marked the boundary with the moor, and it was, Cassandra understood within the first half-mile, built by a man who had never once considered that anyone might ride it slowly. The thoroughbreds went at the first hedge, like they'd been fired from something, and 2 came down almost at once. A bay stumbling badly on the landing, its rider pitching into the frozen grass, with a cry more startled than hurt, and a gray mare refusing outright and spinning her rider half round in a temper. Cassandra took Samson wide, to a gap where a gate stood open for the farm traffic, and lost perhaps 4 lengths for the caution, and gained, she suspected, considerably more in horses still sound beneath her. She had ridden this land her whole life, though never this stretch of it, never past the boundary hedge that marked where Fenwick's fields gave way to Thorncliff's. But land was land in the end, and she had spent enough winters reading it, where the ground held water and where it drained, where the frost lay hard and where the sun had softened it early, that she trusted her eye on Thorncliff's fields nearly as well as her own. Samson trusted her eye too, or trusted something, because he went forward at his own steady, rolling pace and never once faltered on ground that put lighter horses sideways. By the time the field reached the combe, it had thinned considerably. The trees closed overhead, turning the light green and uncertain, and the going underfoot turned to a slick tangle of root and old leaf that made the hot-blooded horses dance and toss their heads in temper. Samson simply slowed and placed his feet, unhurried as a man walking a familiar staircase in the dark, and Cassandra let him. She saw the Duke ahead of her once, his black stallion held to a shortened stride through the worst of the roots, and she saw him glance back, checking his field, she supposed, the way a man checks a fire he's meant to be tending, and his eyes found her again with the same startled focus as before, though the amusement in them had gone somewhere she couldn't name yet. They came, near the comb's far end, to a fallen beech that had brought down half a smaller tree with it, in whatever storm had felled it, blocking the path entirely for anything meaning to jump it clean. The Duke took it at a controlled leap that spoke of long practice. 2 riders behind him refused and doubled back for the detour that would cost them the best part of a mile. Cassandra dismounted, before she'd fully decided to, looped the rein over Samson's head, and led him through a gap in the understory that she'd clocked from 30 yards out. Narrow, thorny, ungainly on foot, but shorter by far than the jump, and shorter still than the detour. Samson followed her without argument, ducking his great head under a branch as if he'd done it every day of his life, which in a sense he had, hauling timber through worse thickets than this one for a decade before he'd ever carried a saddle. She remounted on the far side and found, when she looked up, that she had lost no ground at all to the men who'd jumped. The Duke was watching her do it. She felt the weight of his attention the way she felt weather coming, not seen so much as sensed, a pressure against the skin, and she did not look at him directly, because there was nothing to be gained from confirming what she already knew. He had laughed at her that morning. Whatever he thought now, she owed him no performance of gratitude for the reconsidering. They broke from the trees into open moor, with the light going long and gold across it, and here, at last, was ground built for speed, and here, at last, the day began to cost something even from Samson. He was not built for a flat gallop the way the thoroughbreds were. He had one pace and he kept it, tireless rather than swift, a river running rather than a fire catching. Cassandra took the higher line along the ridge instead of the direct one across the flat, longer by measure, but firmer, and firmness mattered more than distance to a horse his size, and felt Samson settle into it the way he settled into any honest day's work, without complaint and without haste. She was aware, in the particular way one is aware of a held breath, that the black stallion had fallen in some 50 yards behind her and stayed there. The field had thinned to a scant handful by the time the fox, a rangy dog fox that had led them the length of the parish, and clearly had every intention of leading them further, went to ground in a covert on the moor's western edge, and the huntsman called the day's true business done. What remained was the ride home, and the ride home was where Edmund made his error. He had been near the front for most of the afternoon, driving his bay harder than the ground or the hour warranted, his eyes finding Cassandra's steady, unhurried progress each time he glanced behind him, as though her presence there offended him personally. There was a wall at the moor's edge, old and crumbling, and higher than sense allowed in failing light on a tired horse, and Edmund put his bay at it with a viciousness that had nothing to do with the fox and everything to do with his cousin, 50 yards back, on a plough horse that would not, could not, be shaken. The bay caught its hind legs on the coping stones. Cassandra heard the crack of dislodged rock before she understood what it meant, and then the horse was down and Edmund was thrown clear of it in a loose, boneless arc that ended hard against the frozen ground. She was off Samson and running before conscious thought caught up with her legs. Edmund lay curled around his own arm, white-faced, cursing in a low, continuous stream that told her more about the pain than any answer he was likely to give her. She knelt in the wet grass and took his wrist as gently as the urgency allowed, and he flinched and swore at her again, and she ignored both because neither changed what her hands could feel. A break, not a sprain, the bone sitting wrong beneath the skin in a way that made her stomach turn even as her voice stayed level. "Don't move it," she said. "There's a tenant farm, not a quarter-mile east. I can get you there faster on Samson than we can wait for a cart. I don't need your—" He stopped, hissed through his teeth as she shifted her grip to something less likely to jar the joint, and did not finish the sentence, which was, from Edmund, very nearly an apology. The Duke reached them a moment later, off his stallion, before it had fully stopped, and Cassandra looked up at him, the first time all day she had let herself do so directly, and found his face arranged around something she hadn't expected there. Not amusement, not even concern precisely, or not only that. Something closer to the look of a man recalculating a sum he'd thought already settled. "Your Grace," she said, "if your men could help me get him onto my horse, I can lead him to Hollowdean. They'll have a cart and a doctor within the hour." He was quiet long enough that she thought he hadn't heard her. Then, "That won't be necessary, Miss Hale. My men will see to your cousin. You've ridden a long day already." She had expected an argument, or at least a negotiation. She got neither. He gave the orders to the 2 riders nearest him, with the unhurried authority of a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to be obeyed, and within minutes, Edmund was borne away toward the farm's lights with a competence that made her own offer look, in retrospect, like something offered mostly for the sake of having offered it. She remounted Samson in the last of the daylight, bone-tired in a way that went beyond the muscles, and turned him west without waiting to see whether anyone meant to escort her, because she had learned not to wait for things that weren't promised. She heard the stallion's hooves behind her within 100 yards. He did not speak for the better part of a mile, and she did not make him. The dark came down properly as they crossed onto Fenwick land, the hedgerows gone to black shapes against a deepening sky, and Samson walked with his head low and honest, tired but nowhere near beaten, the way he'd have walked home from any full day's ploughing. "He has considerable heart," the Duke said at last, nodding at the horse beneath her, "for a farm animal." "He has the heart of a farmer," she said. "He knows the day isn't done till the sun is." Something shifted at the corner of the Duke's mouth. Not quite a smile, but its nearer relation. He did not answer that, and they rode on, in a silence that had stopped being empty somewhere in the last mile, filled instead with the day's unspoken accounting, the laugh at the drive that morning, the gap through the thicket, the wall, the wrist, all of it sitting between them now, the way stones sit at the bottom of a clear stream, visible and unmentioned. Fenwick's gate posts came up out of the dark. One of them canted a full hand's width from True, where the frost had worked at the footing for 3 winters running, with no money spare to right it. She saw him look at the house beyond. The dark bulk of it, one window lit where Mrs. Pruitt would be waiting up. And she saw him take its measure, the way she'd watched him take the measure of Samson that morning, without cruelty this time, which was somehow worse, because it meant he understood now precisely what he was looking at. Old Tom Bell came out with a lantern before she'd fully halted, his face folding from worry into relief at the sight of her. "Miss Hale, thank God." "We're both of us fine, Tom," she said, though her voice betrayed more of the day than she'd have liked, and slid down from Samson's back with legs that had gone stiff and uncertain from the hours in the saddle. She stood a moment with her hand against his warm flank, steadying herself against him the way she'd steadied herself against that same broad shoulder, more times than she could count since her father died. The Duke dismounted too, unasked. "Allow me to see you to the door, at least." She might have refused. She found, standing in the cold with her legs unsteady, and her cousin's wrist still printed against her palm like a bruise, that she didn't especially want to. They crossed the yard in silence. At the side door, Mrs. Pruitt appeared before they'd reached it, already exclaiming, already reaching to draw Cassandra in out of the cold, and Cassandra paused on the threshold and looked back at the Duke standing in the lantern light with his stallion's reins loose in one hand, looking, for the first time since she'd met him that morning, entirely uncertain what to do with himself. "Thank you for the escort, Your Grace. It wasn't necessary." "I believe it was," he said. She could have let that be the end of it. She was tired enough, and it would have been the sensible thing, the thing that asked nothing further of a day that had already asked so much. Instead, she heard herself say, "Mrs. Pruitt, is there brandy, do you think, for His Grace?" and watched something in his face settle, as if she'd answered a question he hadn't quite worked up the courage to ask. "I'd be glad of it," he said, and stepped past her into the hall. The study was the one room in the house Cassandra hadn't let go to ruin, because it was the room where the actual business of survival got done, and survival did not care for appearances. A small fire held the worst of the chill at bay. The ledgers stood in their accustomed stacks along the desk, and the shelves above held her father's books in their cracked leather spines, and the whole room smelled of wood smoke and old paper and something that she supposed, if pressed, she'd have called endurance. The Duke took the chair she offered, too large in it, she thought, a man built for grander rooms folding himself into a smaller one without complaint, and accepted the brandy she poured with steady hands, though her fingers, when they brushed his in passing the glass, were cold as the night outside. "My cousin believes a woman can't manage 400 acres, she said, because it seemed easier to begin there than anywhere closer to the raw center of it. He spent 8 months proving it to anyone who'll listen. The bank listens rather better than most." "What I saw today," the Duke said, "was not incompetence. What you saw today was a woman with 6 weeks and a bad harvest behind her, trying to convince a county that laughed at her by breakfast that she's fit to be believed by dinner." She hadn't meant to say it quite so plainly, but the day had worn away whatever careful edges she usually kept between herself and other people. You laughed too, Your Grace. I'd rather you didn't pretend otherwise now. He didn't. She would remember that afterward as the thing that tipped the scale, more than anything he did or offered later, that he simply held her gaze and said, "Yes, I did. It was unworthy of a host, and considerably more unworthy of you, and I've no defense to offer beyond the truth, which is that I judged a coat and a horse before I'd troubled to look past either." She hadn't expected the apology. She realized, turning it over, that she'd expected almost anything else. Charity dressed as kindness, kindness dressed as pity, the particular condescension of powerful men who mistook their own good opinion for a gift. This was only honesty, offered plainly, and it cost her something to receive it without flinching. "My cousin means to have Fenwick," she said, "one way or another, before Lady Day. He's arranged the bank's patience to run out exactly when mine does. Then we've 6 weeks to prove him wrong." "We," she repeated, and heard, in her own voice, how much the word weighed. "My steward is the best land manager in 3 counties, and he's been idle since the autumn ditching finished. My solicitor has more patience for tedious correspondence than any man alive, and considerably less patience for bullies. I find myself, Miss Hale, in possession of an arsenal your cousin cannot begin to match, and no particular use for it until this evening." He set the brandy down, untouched beyond the first sip, and something in his bearing shifted from the polished formality of a duke to the plainer register of a man saying something he meant. "I don't offer it as charity. I offer it because I spent the better part of today watching you outride every person on my land, including myself, on a horse bred to pull a cart, and because I don't much care for men who use paperwork as a cudgel against women who've done nothing to deserve it." "Why?" she said, and it came out smaller than she intended. "Would that matter to you?" He considered the question with the same unhurried attention he'd given the fallen beech that morning, as if it too required a clear read of the ground before he committed to an answer. "Because I don't believe I've met anyone in a very long time," he said, "who wasn't performing something for my benefit. You weren't, not once today, not the ride and not this." He gestured, briefly, at the ledgers, the fire, the whole worn, honest room. "I find I'd like to be useful to something real, for once, rather than merely admired for being a duke." She held his gaze a long moment, testing the words for the falseness she'd grown so practiced at finding in Edmund's, and found none. Something in her chest, held tight for 8 months against exactly this kind of hope, loosened by a fraction she wasn't sure she was ready to feel. "Then I accept your help, Your Grace," she said, "and I thank you for it." He inclined his head, and for a moment neither of them said anything further, the fire ticking quietly in the grate, the whole cold house settling around the small, warm fact of an alliance neither had expected to make that morning. At the door, he paused. "His name," he said, glancing toward the window, toward the dark paddock beyond it, where Samson stood cooling under his rug. "Your horse. Samson. Fitting. He's not much for pulling down temples," she said, and something in her own voice surprised her, lighter than she'd managed in months. "No," the Duke agreed, and for the first time all day, he smiled properly, an unguarded thing that changed his whole face, the way sun changes a gray field. But he brought down a duke's opinion of himself rather thoroughly this morning, which I'd count a comparable feat. She laughed, the first real laugh she'd allowed herself since the letter had arrived that morning wrapped around a bank's cold patience, and he left her standing in the firelight with the sound of it still catching in her chest. The 6 weeks that followed were not romantic in any fashion a magazine would have troubled to illustrate. They were ledgers and drainage schemes and long, cold mornings, walking the West Field with the Duke's steward, a dour, capable Yorkshireman named Fenn, who spoke rarely and to good purpose, pointing out where the soil ran rich beneath standing water that wanted only a proper ditch to become the best growing ground on the estate. They were letters from the Duke's solicitor arriving daily, each one a small, precise fortification against whatever Edmund's men attempted next, until Edmund's challenges arrived less often and with less conviction, like a man throwing punches at an opponent who had stopped bothering to flinch. The Duke came often himself, ostensibly to confer with Fenn, and stayed past any reasonable requirement of that pretense. They walked the boundary hedges together in the thin winter light, discussing drainage and, increasingly, other things. Her father, his own father, the particular loneliness of being the last person responsible for a piece of land too large for any one pair of hands. She learned that his sternness was a door kept shut, rather than a wall with nothing behind it. He learned that her quiet was watchfulness, not timidity, and that when she finally spoke, her words had been considered long enough to bear weight. On a clear morning 5 weeks in, standing on the rise above the west meadow where the standing water had finally, properly drained, she watched a heron lift off the new-cut ditch and turn once over the field before it went east, and felt something in her chest that she hadn't felt in the better part of a year, which she eventually identified as simple, unguarded hope. "The bank's man comes Thursday," she said. "He'll find 400 acres in better heart than they've seen in a decade," the Duke said, "and a manager who knows every foot of them better than the man who's contesting her right to it ever will." She didn't answer that at once. The wind came up off the moor, carrying the smell of turned earth and the last of the winter's cold, and she was aware of him beside her, the way she'd become aware, over 5 weeks, of weather, a presence she no longer flinched from, but had simply, gradually, come to expect. "Edmund withdrew his challenge yesterday," she said. "Your solicitor's letter, I gather, finally cost more than the settlement." I'd heard. He didn't sound surprised, or particularly triumphant either, only quietly satisfied, the way a man is satisfied watching a plan he'd trusted come finally to rest. "Fenwick is yours, Miss Hale, unconditionally, and past any further contesting." She let out a breath she hadn't fully known she was holding. Not triumph, exactly, something closer to the particular exhaustion of a soldier finally allowed to set the weapon down. "I don't know that I've thanked you properly." "You needn't. Fenn did the work. I merely supplied the paperwork to keep the wolves at bay while he did it." "The paperwork was rather essential to the outcome," she said, and he huffed something close to a laugh, and for a moment they simply stood together on the rise, the wind moving the bare hedge beside them, the whole recovered valley spread out below in the pale early light. "And what will you do?" he said, "now that the war's concluded?" "I hadn't thought that far." "Then perhaps," he said, and something in his voice had gone lower, more careful, the register of a man approaching ground he hadn't fully surveyed, "you'd allow me to suggest something." He turned to face her fully. She found she wasn't looking away. "I didn't help you to place you in my debt," he said. "I want that understood plainly, before anything else. I helped you because I watched you ride a farm horse across my land with more skill and more nerve than anyone else on it, and because in the 6 weeks since, I've come to think you the most honest person of my acquaintance, and I find I've grown rather unwilling to imagine my days without that honesty in them." He paused, and for the first time since she'd known him, She saw him search for a word and not find it easily. "I'm not offering to rescue you, Miss Hale. You've done that yourself, rather thoroughly, without my help or anyone's. I'm asking whether you'd have me regardless. As a husband, if you'll permit the word its full weight, not because you need saving, because I find I do." She felt the cold air catch in her throat and did not, for a moment, trust herself to answer it. The valley below held the whole shape of the last 8 months, the letter and the draft, the laugh on the drive that had cost more than Edmund's cruelty ever had, the gap in the thicket, the wall, the wrist beneath her hands, the firelight in a room that smelled of wood smoke and old paper and, she understood now, of the last 8 months finally, fully surviving. "The Duke of Thornecliff," she said at last, and there was wonder in it, and something else beneath the wonder that she didn't trouble to hide, asking to marry the woman who rode a farm horse to his steeplechase. "The woman who rode a farm horse to my steeplechase," he said, taking her hand and raising it, cold-knuckled and calloused, to his mouth, "was the only rider on my land that day who wasn't performing for an audience. The rest of us were only pretending to ride." She laughed then, a full, unguarded sound that startled a pair of rooks up out of the near hedge, and said yes before she'd finished laughing, because there seemed, in the end, no version of the answer worth taking longer to arrive at. They were married in April in the small parish church that stood equally between the two estates, attended by tenants and Fenn and Mrs. Pruitt, and none of the county's brighter society, because Cassandra found she had no particular wish to be looked at by people who'd once laughed at her from a well-groomed drive. Edmund did not attend. His name, by mutual and unspoken agreement, was simply not spoken again at Fenwick. That evening, standing on Thorncliff's lawn, with the valley falling away below them toward the lit windows of the house that had nearly been lost, Cassandra felt Gabriel's arm come around her waist, steady as the ground beneath Samson's feet, on the worst ground the moor had to offer. "Happy Duchess," he murmured. "The title will take some getting used to. Take what time you need." He turned her gently, so she faced the dark bulk of Fenwick across the valley, its one lit window standing like a promise kept. "We've the whole of our lives for it." She leaned her head against his shoulder and thought of the letter and the draft, of the drive gone quiet at her arrival, of the laugh she'd carried like a stone in her chest, until it had, somehow, in the space of 6 weeks, become something closer to the first stone of a wall rebuilt rather than the last one to fall. She had not won by vengeance, and she had not won by charm. She had won, in the plainest sense there was, by simply refusing to stop, on a horse nobody else had wanted, across ground nobody else had troubled to learn. She had been seen, finally and completely, by the one man whose good opinion she hadn't even known she wanted, and it had, in the end, made all the difference.